Her chains of gold. Francesca Barone had spent her life playing it safe, avoiding temptation. But when Lorenzo De Luca kissed her in the dark, when his hands pressed her against the cold stone of a church, she forgot everything she had been taught. Now, as their family stood on the brink of war, she felt his breath at her ear, his voice like a promise. "You made your choice, Dulcezza," he murmured. "Now you live with it." Chapter 1. The Sanctuary of Stone and Sin. The air in the church of Santa Maria del Carmine hung thick with the scent of incense and old stone, a familiar comfort that had once soothed Francesca Barone's soul. Now, it felt like a suffocating shroud. The flickering candlelight danced across the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic shadows on the worn marble floor, a grotesque parody of the vibrant life she craved. She knelt in the confessional, the worn velvet of the kneeler offering little solace against the hard wood beneath. Her fingers, usually adorned with delicate rings, were bare, nervously tracing the intricate carvings of the screen separating her from Father Michael. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. She hadn't been to confession in years, not since life had become a carefully constructed facade. "It has been a long time, Francesca." Father Michael's voice was gentle, a familiar rumble that echoed through the small, enclosed space. He had known her since she was a child, had baptized her, seen her through her first communion, her confirmation. He had also, though unspoken, witnessed the slow erosion of her spirit under the weight of her family's legacy. "Too long," she agreed, her voice barely audible. "I have allowed myself to be consumed by darkness." "Darkness takes many forms, my child. Be specific." Francesca hesitated. How could she explain the tangled web of obligation, fear, and a burgeoning, forbidden desire that threatened to consume her? How could she articulate the way Lorenzo De Luca's kiss, pressed upon her in the shadowed alcove of this very church just a week ago, had ignited a fire within her that she thought long extinguished? She closed her eyes, the image of Lorenzo flooding her senses. The rough stubble on his jaw grazing her skin, the scent of his cologne a heady mix of citrus and something darker, something dangerous clinging to the air around her. The way his dark eyes, usually hooded and guarded, had burned with an intensity that had both terrified and thrilled her. The memory was vivid, visceral, a stark contrast to the muted palette of her carefully curated life. "I have entertained feelings for someone I should not," she finally confessed, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. "Someone from the De Luca family?" Father Michael asked, his voice devoid of surprise. He knew, of course. Everyone in their insular world knew. The Barone and De Luca families were ancient rivals, their feud spanning generations, a tapestry woven with blood, betrayal, and a fragile, uneasy truce. Francesca flinched. "Yes." "And these feelings, are they reciprocated?" She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat refusing to dissipate. I believe so." The memory of his words, whispered against her ear after that stolen kiss, returned with a force that made her tremble. "You made your choice, Dulcezza. Now you live with it." The possessiveness in his tone, the underlying threat, had sent a shiver of both fear and excitement down her spine. "This is a dangerous path, Francesca," Father Michael said, his voice laced with concern. "The feud between your families, it runs deep. There are forces at play here that you may not understand." "I know," she whispered, "but I can't seem to stop it. It's like a moth to a flame." She hated the weakness in her voice, the vulnerability she was exposing. She, Francesca Barone, the epitome of composure and control, reduced to a trembling mess by a single kiss. "You must pray for strength, Francesca. For guidance. This infatuation could destroy everything." "I have prayed," she said, a hint of desperation creeping into her tone. But the prayers seemed to fall on deaf ears. Or perhaps, she thought bitterly, they were simply drowned out by the pounding of her own treacherous heart. The silence stretched again, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city, the rumble of a passing car, the faint strains of music from a nearby trattoria. Francesca waited, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Tell me about him, Francesca," Father Michael finally said, his voice softer now, more understanding. "Tell me about Lorenzo De Luca." And so, she did. She spoke of his eyes, the way they seemed to see through her carefully constructed defenses. She spoke of his smile, rare and fleeting, but capable of melting the ice that had encased her heart for so long. She spoke of his strength, the quiet confidence that emanated from him, a stark contrast to the nervous, uncertain men she had been forced to entertain in her carefully orchestrated social life. She didn't speak of the danger, the inherent threat that he represented. She didn't speak of the way her family would react if they knew, the potential for bloodshed and chaos that her feelings could unleash. She focused instead on the man beneath the Mafia persona, the flicker of vulnerability she had glimpsed in his eyes, the hint of loneliness that mirrored her own. As she spoke, a strange sense of calm began to settle over her. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a release, a shedding of the burden she had been carrying for so long. The confessional, once a symbol of her confinement, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where she could finally be honest, if only with herself and a priest bound by secrecy. When she finally fell silent, Father Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice heavy with a mixture of sorrow and warning. "Francesca," he said, "love can be a powerful force, a force for good or for evil. It can heal, but it can also destroy. You must be very careful. This path you are on, it is fraught with peril." But he paused, "Perhaps it is also a path to redemption. For both of you." He gave her absolution, the familiar words washing over her like a balm. But as she rose from the kneeler, a sense of unease lingered. Absolution did not erase the reality of her situation. It did not change the fact that she was a Barone, and he was a De Luca, and that their families were on the brink of war. A war that her forbidden love might very well ignite. She felt a sudden chill, despite the warmth of the church. She saw movement outside, in the pews. A figure. Was it him? Chapter 2. Echoes of a Forgotten Promise. The figure in the pew hadn't been Lorenzo. It was only old Signora Bellini, a fixture of the church, her wrinkled face etched with a lifetime of prayers and sorrows. Francesca offered her a small, polite smile, a reflex honed over years of social obligations. Signora Bellini responded with a knowing nod, her eyes, though clouded with age, sharp and perceptive. Francesca felt a flush creep up her neck. Did the old woman know? Could she sense the turmoil raging beneath Francesca's carefully composed exterior? She quickly made her way out of the church, the heavy wooden doors closing behind her with a resounding thud that echoed the finality of her confession. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the piazza, painting the ancient cobblestones in hues of gold and amber. The air, though still carrying the lingering scent of incense from the church, was also filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread from the nearby panificio and the lively chatter of people enjoying their passeggiata, the traditional evening stroll. For a moment, Francesca allowed herself to be swept up in the normalcy of it all, the comforting rhythm of everyday life. It was a world away from the hushed whispers and veiled threats that permeated her family's world, a world she had always longed to escape, yet felt inextricably bound to. She walked towards the small, unassuming trattoria that her family had frequented for generations. Trattoria del Sol it was called, a name that belied its often shadowy clientele. It was a neutral ground, a place where even rivals like the Baroness and De Lucas could occasionally break bread, albeit with a healthy dose of suspicion and unspoken tension. As she approached, she saw her brother, Marco, standing outside, his broad shoulders tense, his dark eyes scanning the street. He was the eldest, the heir apparent to their father's empire, a man burdened by responsibility and hardened by the brutal realities of their world. He spotted her and his face softened slightly, a flicker of genuine affection in his eyes. "Francesca," he said, his voice a low rumble, "Papa is waiting." She nodded, her stomach clenching with a familiar mix of apprehension and resignation. Family dinners were rarely relaxed affairs. They were strategic meetings, veiled in the guise of familial affection, where alliances were forged and betrayals were plotted. Inside, the trattoria was a haven of warmth and rustic charm. The walls were adorned with faded frescoes depicting scenes of Roman mythology, the air filled with the clatter of cutlery and the murmur of conversation. The aroma of garlic, tomatoes, and oregano hung heavy in the air, a comforting, familiar scent that usually soothed her. But tonight, even the familiar comfort of the trattoria couldn't quell the unease that gnawed at her. Her father, Don Antonio Barone, sat at their usual table in the back corner, a position that afforded him a clear view of the entrance and the street beyond. He was a formidable figure, even in his advancing years, his silver hair slicked back, his dark eyes sharp and unwavering. He held court with the gravitas of a Roman emperor, his every gesture, every word, imbued with power and authority. Beside him sat her mother, Isabella, a woman of striking beauty and quiet strength. She was the glue that held their family together, the mediator, the peacemaker. Her presence was a calming influence, a subtle reminder that even in their world of violence and betrayal, there was still room for love and compassion. Francesca, mia figlia, her father said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. He gestured for her to sit beside him. You are late. I was at confession, Papa, she replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect crossed his face. He knew she had distanced herself from the church in recent years. Her return, however brief, was a sign, a subtle shift in the delicate balance of their family dynamic. And what did you confess, Cara? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Francesca met his gaze, her chin held high. That is between me and God, Papa. A tense silence hung in the air. Her father was not a man accustomed to being denied, but he simply nodded, a grudging acknowledgement of her defiance. The meal proceeded with the usual undercurrent of tension. Marco spoke of business dealings, of escalating tensions with the De Luca family. Her father listened intently, his face a mask of impassivity, occasionally interjecting with a sharp question or a pointed comment. Isabella, as always, tried to steer the conversation towards lighter topics, but her efforts were largely unsuccessful. Francesca picked at her food, her appetite gone. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past week, the stolen kiss, the whispered words, the forbidden desire that threatened to consume her. She felt a pang of guilt, a sense of betrayal. She was playing a dangerous game, a game that could have devastating consequences for everyone she loved. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned, inevitably, to the upcoming wedding of her cousin, Sophia. It was a strategic alliance, a merging of two powerful families, a move designed to strengthen their position against the De Lucas. Francesca had always known that her own marriage would be similarly orchestrated, a pawn in her father's game of power. We must find you a suitable husband, Francesca, her father said, his eyes fixed on her. Someone strong, someone loyal, someone who can contribute to the family. She felt a cold dread creep through her veins. She knew this was coming, had always known it. But the reality of it, the prospect of spending her life with a man she didn't love, a man chosen for her, filled her with a sense of despair. I am not ready for marriage, Papa, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Nonsense, he scoffed. You are 28 years old. It is time. Perhaps, Isabella interjected gently, Francesca needs more time. She is still grieving. Her father waved his hand dismissively. Grieving? For what? A life she never truly lived? Francesca flinched. His words, though harsh, held a grain of truth. She had spent her life conforming, obeying, suppressing her own desires. She had allowed herself to become a shadow, a pale imitation of the woman she longed to be. And it was a long-ago promise, made to a dying friend, that kept her chained to this existence. Suddenly, a commotion at the entrance to the trattoria drew their attention. Whispers rippled through the room. Francesca felt her heart skip a beat. She knew, even before she saw him, who it was. Lorenzo de Luca stood in the doorway, his dark eyes scanning the room, his presence radiating a dangerous, magnetic energy. He was a storm brewing in the calm of the evening, a threat and a promise all wrapped into one. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and a spark ignited, a silent acknowledgement of the forbidden connection between them. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment of intense, unspoken desire. He moved, a subtle shift of his weight, as if to approach. But then, Marco stepped in front of her, blocking her view, his body a shield against the storm. Chapter 3. The Weight of Family Secrets. Marco's presence, a solid, protective wall between Francesca and Lorenzo, was a stark reminder of the chasm that separated them. It was more than just a physical barrier, it was the embodiment of generations of animosity, a tangible representation of the feud that had defined their families for as long as anyone could remember. Lorenzo's gaze lingered on Marco for a moment, a silent challenge, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his dark eyes. Then he turned, his attention seemingly drawn to the group of men who had accompanied him as capos, lieutenants, the muscle of the De Luca family. They were a formidable bunch, their faces hardened, their eyes betraying a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous waters of their world. Francesca watched him, her heart pounding against her ribs, a mixture of fear and fascination swirling within her. He moved with a grace that belied his power, a predator in his natural habitat. He exuded an aura of danger, a sense of controlled violence that both terrified and intrigued her. Her father, Don Antonio, rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. He approached Lorenzo, his hand outstretched, a gesture of forced civility. "Lorenzo," he said, his voice a low rumble, "a surprise to see you here." "Don Antonio," Lorenzo replied, his voice equally smooth, equally guarded. He clasped Don Antonio's hand, the brief handshake a tense, symbolic exchange of power. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd pay my respects." The words were polite, but the underlying message was clear. "I am here. I am watching. I am a force to be reckoned with." The two men stood there for a moment, locked in a silent battle of wills, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Francesca felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was a dangerous game, a delicate dance on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, one misplaced word, could ignite the powder keg that had been simmering between their families for decades. Isabella, sensing the escalating tension, stepped forward, her voice calm and soothing. "Lorenzo, how is your mother, Sophia?" she asked, diverting the conversation to a more neutral topic. Lorenzo's expression softened slightly, a flicker of genuine warmth in his eyes. "She is well. Thank you, Isabella. She sends her regards." The conversation continued, a carefully choreographed exchange of pleasantries, a facade of civility masking the underlying animosity. Francesca watched, her mind racing. She knew this was all a show, a performance for the benefit of the onlookers. But beneath the surface, the currents of hatred and suspicion ran deep. She caught Lorenzo's eye again, a fleeting glance, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that still simmered between them. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, a secret message in a room full of watchful eyes. The De Lucas didn't stay long. Their departure was as swift and calculated as their arrival, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the Trattoria. As soon as they were gone, Don Antonio turned to Marco, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowed. "What was that about?" "They're testing us, Papa," Marco replied, his voice tight with anger. "Trying to provoke us." "Let them try," Don Antonio said, his voice a low growl. "We will not be intimidated." Francesca remained silent, her mind reeling. The encounter had shaken her, had reinforced the reality of her situation. She was caught in the crossfire of a war that had been raging long before she was born, a war that she had no desire to fight, but from which she could not escape. The weight of her family's secrets pressed down on her, a heavy burden she had carried for years. The truth about her father's business, the violence, the betrayals, the constant threat of danger. It was a world she had always tried to distance herself from, a world she had desperately wanted to believe she could escape. But the events of the past week, the encounter with Lorenzo, had forced her to confront the reality of her situation. She could no longer pretend, could no longer hide behind the facade of normalcy she had so carefully constructed. Later that evening, back in the quiet solitude of her room, Francesca sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. The city, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a cage, a gilded prison that held her captive. She thought of Lorenzo, of his kiss, of the fire he had ignited within her. She knew it was wrong, knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force that drew her to him. She reached for the small, antique wooden box that sat on her bedside table. It was a keepsake, a memento of a life she had almost forgotten, a life before the weight of her family's legacy had crushed her spirit. Inside the box were a few treasured possessions, a faded photograph of her and her childhood friend, Isabella, not her mother, but a girl she'd known since she was 10, the promise she'd made still binding, a dried flower pressed between the pages of a book, a small, silver locket containing a lock of hair. They were remnants of a simpler time, a time before the darkness had closed in. The promise, made when she was a teenager on her deathbed, bound Francesca still. Isabella, frail and dying young, had asked only one thing: stay. Stay with our family. Protect them. Don't leave, like everyone else. Francesca had agreed, blind to what it truly meant. She closed the box, the weight of the past pressing down on her. She was trapped, bound by duty, by loyalty, by a promise she had made long ago. But the encounter with Lorenzo had awakened something within her, a spark of rebellion, a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a way to break free. Even a glimmer of the life she'd abandoned, a life of helping the less fortunate, called to her, muted though it seemed now. A sudden noise at her window made her start. A small pebble, tapping against the glass. He was there, below, waiting. Chapter 4. A dance on the edge of danger. The pebble against the glass was a summons, a silent invitation to a world of shadows and forbidden desires. Francesca hesitated for only a moment, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The rational part of her brain screamed at her to stay put, to ignore the call, to remain within the safe confines of her gilded cage. But the rebellious spark that Lorenzo had ignited within her, the yearning for something more, overrode her fear. She slipped on a dark shawl, the soft fabric a comforting weight against her skin, and quietly opened the window. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and the distant sounds of the city. Below, in the shadowed courtyard, Lorenzo stood waiting, his figure a dark silhouette against the moonlit fountain. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers, a silent communication passing between them. He gestured towards the small, wrought iron gate that led to the garden, a secret passage known only to a few. Francesca slipped out of the window, her movements surprisingly agile, despite her years of carefully cultivated composure. She felt a thrill of exhilaration, a sense of liberation that she hadn't experienced in years. It was a dangerous game she was playing, a dance on the edge of a precipice, but for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. She navigated the familiar paths of the garden, the scent of roses and lavender filling the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had permeated the trattoria earlier that evening. The garden had always been her sanctuary, a place of refuge from the pressures of her family's world. Now it was a meeting place, a clandestine rendezvous point for a forbidden romance. Lorenzo waited for her by the gate, his hand outstretched. She took it, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. His grip was firm, possessive, a silent claim that both thrilled and terrified her. "You came," he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against her ear. "I shouldn't have," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, but the words lacked conviction. She shouldn't have, but she had. And she couldn't deny the excitement that coursed through her. He didn't reply, simply led her through the gate and into the narrow, cobblestone alleyway that ran behind the family estate. It was a hidden world, a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, a place where the rules of their society didn't apply. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing on the ancient stones, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the overhanging trees. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that crackled between them. "Why did you come tonight, Lorenzo?" Francesca finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. "To the trattoria, I mean." He stopped, turning to face her, his dark eyes searching hers. "I told your father," he said, his voice low and intense. "I came to pay my respects." "But that wasn't a real reason, was it?" He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Perhaps I wanted to see you." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. It was an admission, a declaration of intent, a challenge to the carefully constructed world that separated them. Francesca felt her heart skip a beat. She knew she was playing with fire, that this whatever this was could destroy everything. But she couldn't help but be drawn to him, to the danger he represented, to the promise of something more than the sterile, predictable life she had always known. "This is madness, Lorenzo," she said, her voice trembling slightly. We shouldn't?" He repeated, his voice a low growl. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a wave of heat through her body. "Or won't?" She closed her eyes, her senses overwhelmed by his proximity, by the scent of his cologne, by the warmth of his touch. She was drowning in him, losing herself in the forbidden desire that had been simmering between them since that stolen kiss in the church. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. She hesitated for only a moment, her mind screaming at her to pull away, to run, to save herself. But her body betrayed her, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, a gentle exploration of uncharted territory. Then, it deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. Release of pent-up desire, a defiance of the rules that bound them. Francesca clung to him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body molding against his. She forgot everything, her family, her obligations, the feud that separated them. All that mattered was this moment, this stolen kiss, this forbidden connection. But the moment couldn't last. Reality intruded, a harsh reminder of the dangers that lurked around every corner. A distant siren, the sound of footsteps approaching, a whispered warning from the shadows they were not alone. Lorenzo pulled away, his eyes dark with a mixture of passion and frustration. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Someone's coming." He grabbed her hand, pulling her along the narrow alleyway, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. They ran, their hearts pounding in unison, the adrenaline coursing through their veins. It was a desperate flight, a race against time, a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of their actions. They reached the end of the alleyway, emerging onto a bustling street, the bright lights and noise of the city a stark contrast to the quiet intimacy of their clandestine meeting. Lorenzo hailed a cab, his movements swift and efficient, his eyes constantly scanning the street, alert for any sign of danger. He pushed her into the back seat, his body shielding her from view. "Go home, Francesca," he said, his voice urgent. "And be careful." He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing the finality of their parting. The cab sped away, leaving Lorenzo standing on the curb, a solitary figure in the crowded street. Francesca watched him until he disappeared from view, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and fear. The dance had been exhilarating, but the music had stopped, and the threat of the fall remained. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Shadow of Betrayal. The taxi ride back to the Barone estate was a blur. Francesca sat huddled in the back seat, her mind racing, her body still trembling from the adrenaline rush of their escape. The city lights, usually a comforting presence, now seemed to mock her, a reminder of the double life she was leading, the dangerous game she was playing. She replayed the events of the evening in her mind, the stolen kiss, the whispered words, the frantic escape. Each memory was a double-edged sword, a source of both exhilaration and terror. She had crossed a line, a point of no return. There was no going back now. As the taxi pulled up to the imposing gates of the Barone estate, Francesca felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She had to face her family, had to maintain the facade of composure, had to pretend that nothing had happened. It was a daunting task, a performance that required every ounce of her strength and cunning. She paid the driver, her hands shaking slightly, and stepped out of the cab. The gates swung open, revealing the long, winding driveway that led to the main house. The estate, usually a symbol of power and security, now felt like a prison, a gilded cage that held her captive. She walked slowly towards the house, her footsteps echoing on the gravel path, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the city. She could see the lights on in the main house, a sign that her family was still awake, waiting for her. As she approached the front door, she saw Marco standing on the porch, his arms crossed, his expression grim. He had been waiting for her. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Francesca took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. "I went for a walk," she replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "I needed some air." Marco raised an eyebrow, his disbelief evident. "A walk? At this hour? Dressed like that?" Francesca's shawl, the very one she had worn to conceal herself earlier, was now evidence against her. She forced a smile, a practiced gesture of innocence. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I needed to clear my head." Marco studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers, trying to penetrate the facade she had so carefully constructed. He was no fool. He knew her too well, had grown up with her, had witnessed her struggles, her attempts to escape the suffocating grip of their family's world. "Don't lie to me, Francesca," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I know something's going on." Francesca hesitated, her mind racing. She could deny it, could continue the charade, could try to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But she was tired of lying, tired of pretending. And she knew, deep down, that Marco deserved the truth, or at least a part of it. "I met someone," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Marco's expression hardened. "Who?" Francesca hesitated again. She couldn't reveal Lorenzo's name, couldn't expose him, couldn't risk the consequences. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" Marco repeated, his voice laced with anger. "What's complicated, Francesca? Are you involved with someone from them?" The unspoken accusation hung in the air, a heavy weight that threatened to crush her. Francesca didn't answer, her silence confirmation enough. Marco ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Damn it, Francesca," he said, his voice a low growl. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? This could destroy everything." "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't help it." Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, concern, and a hint of pity. He knew, better than anyone, the burden she carried, the pressure she was under. He had always been her protector, her confidant, the one person she could truly trust. "You have to end it, Francesca," he said, his voice firm. "Before it's too late." Francesca nodded, her tears finally spilling over. She knew he was right, knew that this forbidden romance was doomed, that it could only lead to pain and destruction. But the thought of ending it, of severing the connection with Lorenzo, filled her with a sense of despair. Marco pulled her into a hug, his embrace tight, protective. "I'm here for you, Francesca," he said, his voice softer now. "Always." They stood there for a moment, clinging to each other, the silence broken only by Francesca's sobs. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a brief respite from the storm that was raging around them. But the respite was short-lived. As they pulled apart, they heard voices coming from inside the house, raised voices, angry voices. Something was wrong. Marco's expression turned grim. "Stay here," he said, his voice urgent. He disappeared inside the house, leaving Francesca alone on the porch, her heart pounding with a sense of foreboding. She waited, her senses on high alert, listening to the sounds coming from inside. She could hear her father's voice, a low, menacing growl, and Marco's voice, trying to reason with him. There were other voices too, unfamiliar voices, voices that sent a chill down her spine. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and Marco emerged, his face pale, his eyes wide with alarm. "They know," he said, his voice hoarse. "Someone betrayed us. The DeLucas, they're coming." Betrayal had come, it seemed, from within her own family. Whispers in the dark had turned into a roar. Chapter 6. The Price of Loyalty and Longing. "They're coming?" Francesca repeated, her voice a choked whisper, the blood draining from her face. The words hung in the air, heavy with dread, a confirmation of her worst fears. The fragile peace, the carefully constructed facade, had shattered. The war had begun. Marco grabbed her arm, his grip tight, urgent. "We have to go now." But Papa Mama, Francesca protested, her mind reeling, struggling to comprehend the sudden turn of events. "There's no time," Marco said, his voice harsh, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "They'll be here any minute." He pulled her towards the back of the house, away from the main entrance, towards the garden, the same path she had taken earlier that evening with Lorenzo. The garden, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, a maze of shadows and hidden dangers. They ran, their footsteps echoing on the stone paths, the scent of roses and lavender now a cruel mockery of the beauty that had once soothed her. The sounds of the city, the distant sirens, seemed to be closing in, a symphony of chaos and impending doom. "Who betrayed us?" Francesca asked, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind struggling to make sense of the betrayal. "I don't know," Marco replied, his voice tight with anger and frustration. "But I'll find out. And they'll pay." The threat in his voice was clear, a promise of retribution, a testament to the brutal code of honor that governed their world. Loyalty was paramount, betrayal unforgivable, and the price of both was often paid in blood. They reached the small, wrought iron gate that led to the alleyway, the same gate Lorenzo had used earlier. Marco fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking, the urgency of their situation fueling his desperation. "Hurry," Francesca urged, her heart pounding against her ribs, the fear threatening to consume her. Finally, the lock clicked open, and Marco pushed the gate open, pulling her through into the narrow, dark alleyway. They ran, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, the shadows closing in around them. "Where are we going?" Francesca asked, her voice trembling, her mind filled with a growing sense of despair. "Somewhere safe," Marco replied, his voice grim, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, alert for any sign of danger. "Somewhere they won't find us." But Francesca knew, deep down, that there was no truly safe place. Not in their world. Not anymore. The betrayal had changed everything, had shattered the illusion of security, had exposed the fragility of their existence. They reached the end of the alleyway, emerging onto a quiet, residential street. Marco flagged down a passing car, a nondescript sedan, its windows tinted, its driver a loyal member of their famiglia. "Get in," Marco ordered, his voice sharp, his eyes filled with a steely determination. Francesca obeyed, sliding into the back seat, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Marco climbed in beside her, his presence a small comfort in the midst of the chaos. The car sped away, leaving the Barone estate behind, a symbol of their shattered world, a monument to the betrayal that had changed their lives forever. As they drove, Francesca couldn't help but think of Lorenzo. Was he safe? Was he involved in this? Had he known about the betrayal? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, a tormenting reminder of the forbidden love that had brought them to this point. She looked at Marco, his face etched with worry and determination. He was her brother, her protector, the one person she could always rely on. But even he couldn't shield her from the reality of their situation, from the consequences of her choices. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. the words heavy with a sense of foreboding. Marco didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights, his mind clearly wrestling with the weight of their predicament. "We fight," he finally said, his voice low and resolute, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "We fight for our family. We fight for our honor. And we fight for survival." His words were a declaration of war, a commitment to the brutal code that governed their lives. But they also held a glimmer of something else, a flicker of hope, a determination to overcome the odds, to find a way through the darkness. The car continued its journey through the night, carrying them towards an uncertain future, a future filled with danger, betrayal, and the enduring power of loyalty and longing. Francesca looked out the window, one stray tear finally escaping. It wasn't for her family, not now. It was for him. Chapter 7. Beneath the veil of civility. The safe house was anything but. It was a small, nondescript apartment in a working-class neighborhood, far from the opulent grandeur of the Barone estate. The walls were thin, the furniture worn, the air thick with the smell of stale cooking and something else, something indefinable, a scent of desperation and hidden lives. It was a world away from the life Francesca had always known, a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Marco paced the small living room, his energy restless, his mind clearly racing, planning, strategizing. He was on the phone constantly, his voice low and urgent, speaking in rapid Italian, issuing orders, gathering information, trying to piece together the puzzle of the betrayal. Francesca sat on the worn sofa, her body numb, her mind reeling. She felt like a spectator in her own life, watching events unfold with a sense of detached disbelief. The reality of their situation had yet to fully sink in, the shock still insulating her from the full force of the fear and despair. She thought of her parents, of Don Antonio and Isabella, left behind at the estate, vulnerable, exposed. She wondered if they were safe, if they had managed to escape. The thought of them in danger filled her with a cold dread, a guilt that gnawed at her conscience. She also thought of Lorenzo, the image of his face, his dark eyes, his slow, dangerous smile, burned into her memory. Was he safe? Was he thinking of her? Was he, even now, plotting against her family? The questions tormented her, a constant reminder of the forbidden love that had brought them to this point. The hours passed slowly, each tick of the clock an agonizing reminder of the uncertainty that lay ahead. Marco continued his frantic phone calls, his face growing grimmer with each passing conversation. The news, it seemed, was not good. Finally, he hung up the phone, his shoulders slumping, his expression one of defeated exhaustion. He looked at Francesca, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "They got Papa," he said, his voice hoarse, the words heavy with a grief he couldn't fully express. Francesca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, a wave of nausea washing over her. "What? How?" "Ambushed," Marco replied, his voice tight with anger. "On his way to a meeting. It was a setup." "Is he?" Francesca couldn't bring herself to say the word, the thought of her father dead too painful to bear. "He's alive," Marco said, his voice a low growl, "but badly injured." "They're holding him." "Holding him?" Francesca repeated, her mind struggling to comprehend the implications. "Hostage?" Marco nodded, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a fury that was both terrifying and reassuring. "They want to negotiate. They want concessions." "Concessions?" Francesca repeated, her voice trembling. "What kind of concessions?" Marco hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "They want you." The words hit Francesca like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of her. She stared at Marco, her mind reeling, struggling to process the enormity of what he had just said. "Me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They want me?" Marco nodded, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sorrow. "They know about you and Lorenzo. They see you as a bargaining chip, a way to force our hand." Francesca felt a cold dread creep through her veins. She was a pawn in their game, a prize to be won or lost, a tool to be used for their own twisted purposes. Her forbidden love, her stolen moments of passion, had become a weapon that was now being used against her own family. Beneath the veil of any sort of civility and negotiation, they saw an opportunity, one they fully intended to exploit. What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice trembling, her mind filled with a growing sense of panic. Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and determination. "You have a choice, Francesca," he said, his voice firm. "You can go to them, become their prisoner, and hope that they'll release Papa. Or you can refuse and risk the consequences." The choice was a cruel one, a dilemma that tore at her soul. Sacrifice herself, her freedom, her future, for the sake of her father? Or refuse and risk his life, betray her family, and live with the guilt forever? She closed her eyes, her mind racing, weighing the options, searching for a way out, a solution that didn't involve sacrificing everything she held dear. But there was no easy answer, no escape from the brutal reality of their situation. She thought of Lorenzo, of his kiss, of the fire he had ignited within her. Could she trust him? Could she believe that he would protect her, even if she became his family's prisoner? Or was he simply using her, manipulating her, playing a game of cat and mouse that she could never win? The weight of her decision pressed down on her, a crushing burden that threatened to break her. She was trapped, caught between two impossible choices, her loyalty and her longing pulling her in opposite directions. The whispers of betrayal had become a deafening roar, and she was caught in the center of the storm. Outside the window, dawn began to break. It was a bleak sunrise. Chapter 8. Scars of the Past, Flames of the Future. The bleak sunrise brought with it no clarity, only a deepening sense of despair. Francesca had spent the rest of the night wrestling with her impossible choice, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions, her heart torn between loyalty and longing. Marco had tried to offer her comfort, to reassure her, but his words were hollow, his reassurances empty. He was as trapped as she was, bound by the same code of honor, the same family obligations, the same inescapable reality of their world. As the morning wore on, the apartment became a hive of activity. Members of their famiglia arrived, their faces grim, their voices hushed, their presence a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. They were soldiers, loyal foot soldiers in her father's empire, ready to fight, to kill, to die for the family. Francesca watched them, her heart heavy with a sense of responsibility. Her choices, her actions had consequences, not just for herself, but for all of them. She was a Barone, and the weight of that name, the legacy of that family, pressed down on her with crushing force. She thought of her mother, Isabella, still unaware of the night's events, still believing in the fragile peace, the illusion of normalcy. Francesca longed to speak to her, to hear her voice, to feel her comforting presence. But she knew it was impossible, too dangerous. Any contact could put her mother at risk, could expose her to the same dangers that now threatened Francesca. She also thought of Lorenzo, the image of his face, his dark eyes, his touch, still vivid in her memory. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he knew about her father, about the demands for her surrender. Was he celebrating his family's victory? Or was he, too, caught in the web of betrayal and violence? The uncertainty tormented her, a constant gnawing at her conscience. She had to make a decision, had to choose a path, had to face the consequences of her actions. But the weight of that decision, the potential for disaster, paralyzed her. As the day wore on, Marco received a message, a communication from the DeLucas. It was a video, a short, brutal clip that showed her father, Don Antonio, bruised and battered, but alive. He was sitting in a chair, his hands bound, his face a mask of pain and defiance. The video was a clear message, a threat, a demonstration of the DeLucas power. They were in control, and they were willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. Francesca watched the video, her heart breaking, her tears flowing freely. She felt a surge of anger, a burning desire for revenge, a primal urge to protect her father, to make the DeLucas pay for their cruelty. But she also felt a sense of helplessness, a realization that she was a pawn in their game, a piece to be moved on the chessboard of their power struggle. She had no control, no agency, no way to influence the outcome. After the video, Marco turned to her, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "They want an answer," he said, his voice low and urgent. "By tonight." Francesca nodded, her mind numb, her body trembling. She knew what she had to do. There was no other choice. "I'll go," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words heavy with a sense of resignation. "I'll go to them." Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and respect. He knew the sacrifice she was making, the courage it took to face such a terrifying prospect. "I'll try to negotiate," he said, his voice firm. "I'll try to find a way to get you both back." But Francesca knew, deep down, that there was little hope. The DeLucas were not known for their mercy, their compassion. They were ruthless, brutal, and they would not hesitate to use her to achieve their goals. As the day drew to a close, Francesca prepared herself for the inevitable. She changed into a simple black dress, a symbol of mourning, a premonition of the darkness that lay ahead. She looked in the mirror, her reflection staring back at her, a stranger, a woman transformed by the events of the past few days. She saw the scars of the past, the wounds that had never fully healed, the years of suppressed emotions, of unspoken desires. But she also saw something else, a flicker of defiance, a spark of hope, a flame of a future that she might yet be able to forge. The life she had always known, the carefully constructed facade, had been shattered. But from the ashes, something new could rise, something stronger, something truer. She was a Barone, yes, but she was also Francesca. And she would not go down without a fight. Even if that fight meant facing the very man who had awakened her dormant heart. Chapter 9. A glimmer of hope in the gathering storm. The journey to the DeLuca compound was a silent, tense affair. Francesca sat in the back of the car, flanked by two of Marco's most trusted men, their faces grim, their hands never far from the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of color and movement that seemed a world away from the dark, dangerous reality she was heading towards. She tried to focus on the present, on the immediate task at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to Lorenzo. She pictured his face, his eyes, the way he had looked at her, the way he had kissed her. Was he waiting for her? Was he part of this plan? Or was he, too, a victim of the circumstances, caught in the crossfire of a war that had been raging long before they were born? The questions tormented her, a constant reminder of the complex, tangled web of their relationship. She had allowed herself to fall for him, to open her heart to him, despite the risks, despite the dangers. And now, she was paying the price. As they approached the DeLuca compound, Francesca felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. It was a fortress, a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls, guarded by armed men, a symbol of the DeLucas' power and ruthlessness. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a place where violence and betrayal were commonplace. The car pulled up to the main gate, and the guards, their faces impassive, their eyes cold and calculating, approached. They spoke to Marco's men in hushed tones, their words clipped, their movements precise. There was a tense exchange, a silent negotiation, a transfer of power. Francesca watched, her heart pounding against her ribs, her fear a palpable presence in the confined space of the car. She was a prisoner, a hostage, a bargaining chip in a game she didn't understand, a game she had no control over. Finally, the gates swung open, and the car drove through, entering the DeLuca compound. Francesca felt a sense of finality, a realization that she had crossed a threshold, a point of no return. There was no going back now. The car stopped in front of the main house, a grand, imposing structure that exuded wealth and power. It was a stark contrast to the Barone estate, which, despite its opulence, had always felt like a home, a place of warmth and family. This was a fortress, a symbol of dominance, a place where enemies were crushed and alliances were forged in blood. The car door opened, and Francesca stepped out, her legs trembling slightly. She stood there for a moment, taking in her surroundings, her senses on high alert. The air was heavy with tension, with the scent of fear and anticipation. She saw him then, standing on the steps of the main house, his figure silhouetted against the brightly lit entrance. Lorenzo. He was dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on her. He descended the steps, his movements slow and deliberate, his presence radiating a dangerous, magnetic energy. He approached her, his gaze unwavering, his silence a palpable force. Francesca stood her ground, her chin held high, her eyes meeting his. She would not show fear, would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She was a Barone, and she would face whatever came her way with courage and defiance. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body, could smell his familiar scent, a mix of citrus and something darker, something dangerous. He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her thoughts, her emotions. "Francesca," he said, his voice a low murmur, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. It was the first time he had spoken to her since the night they had fled the alleyway. "Lorenzo," she replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, with unacknowledged emotions. The tension was palpable, a crackling energy that filled the space between them. "You came," he said, his voice a statement, not a question. "I had no choice," she replied, her voice laced with a hint of bitterness. He nodded, his expression unchanged. "I know." He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. It was a gesture of possession, a claim, a silent reminder of the power he held over her. "Come," he said, his voice softer now. "We have much to discuss." He led her towards the main house, his hand still on her arm, guiding her, controlling her. Francesca followed, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was entering the lion's den, walking into the heart of the enemy's territory. But as she walked beside him, she felt a glimmer of something else, a flicker of hope in the gathering storm. His touch, his gaze, his presence, despite the circumstances, still stirred something within her, a longing, a desire, a connection that defied logic and reason. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way through this, a way to navigate the treacherous waters of their world, a way to find a future together, despite the odds. The hope was fragile, a tiny spark in the darkness, but it was there. And she would cling to it, nurture it, protect it with every fiber of her being. Chapter 10. The Crossroads of Choice and Consequence. Inside the DeLuca mansion, the opulence was overwhelming, a display of wealth and power designed to intimidate and impress. The walls were adorned with priceless artwork, the floors covered in Persian rugs, the furniture crafted from the finest materials. It was a world of luxury and excess, a stark contrast to the humble apartment where Francesca had spent the previous night. Lorenzo led her through a series of grand rooms, each more lavish than the last, until they reached a large, dimly lit study. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany desk, behind which sat a man Francesca recognized instantly. Donatello DeLuca, Lorenzo's father, the head of the DeLuca family, the architect of her current predicament. Donatello was a formidable figure, his presence radiating authority and menace. He was older than her father, his hair completely white, but his eyes were sharp and piercing, his gaze unwavering. He looked at Francesca with a mixture of disdain and calculation, as if assessing her worth, her value as a bargaining chip. "So," Donatello said, his voice a low growl, his accent thicker than Lorenzo's, "the Barone princess has arrived." Francesca met his gaze, her chin held high. "I am here as you demanded." "Indeed," Donatello replied, a smirk playing on his lips. "And your father's health hangs in the balance." "He is injured because of you," Francesca said, her voice tight with anger. He is injured because of his own stubbornness, Donatello countered. He refused to cooperate. He brought this upon himself. Lorenzo, who had been standing silently beside Francesca, finally spoke. "Father," he said, his voice calm but firm, "that's enough." Donatello turned his gaze to his son, his expression hardening. "This is business, Lorenzo. Stay out of it." "She is my guest," Lorenzo replied, his voice unwavering, "and I will not have her treated with disrespect." The tension in the room was palpable, a clash of wills between father and son, a struggle for dominance. Francesca watched, her heart pounding, uncertain of Lorenzo's motives, unsure of his true allegiance. Donatello studied his son for a moment, his eyes narrowed. Then, he turned back to Francesca, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his gaze. "Very well," he said. "Let us discuss the terms of your stay." The terms, as Donatello outlined them, were harsh and unforgiving. Francesca was to remain at the De Luca compound, under constant surveillance, her movements restricted, her contact with the outside world severed. She was, in effect, a prisoner, a hostage, her freedom forfeit until her father met the De Luca's demands. The demands themselves were exorbitant. A significant transfer of territory, a share of the Baron's lucrative businesses, and a public apology for past transgressions. It was a humiliation, a crippling blow to the Baron family's power and prestige. Francesca listened, her mind reeling, her heart sinking. She knew her father would never agree to such terms, would never surrender to such humiliation. He would rather die than submit to the De Luca's demands. "My father will never agree to this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Then he will die," Donatello replied coldly. "And you will remain here, forever." The words hung in the air, heavy with menace, a chilling reminder of the stakes. Francesca felt a cold dread creep through her veins. She was trapped, caught between two impossible choices, her father's life hanging in the balance. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes pleading, searching for a sign of hope, a glimmer of compassion. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, his eyes betraying nothing. "There must be another way," she said, her voice desperate. "A compromise." Something Donatello laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "There are no compromises, Principessa. Only winners and losers. And in this game, the De Lucas always win." Francesca felt a surge of despair, a crushing sense of hopelessness. She was at their mercy, a pawn in their game, her fate sealed. But then, Lorenzo spoke again, his voice low and firm, cutting through the tension in the room. "There is another way," he said, his gaze fixed on his father. "A way to end this feud, once and for all." Donatello turned to his son, his eyebrows raised, his expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "And what is this other way?" Lorenzo took a step closer to Francesca, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek, his touch sending a shiver through her. "Marriage," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "Francesca and I will marry. We will unite the two families and end this bloodshed." The words hung in the air, a bombshell, a shocking proposition that took everyone by surprise. Francesca stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart pounding. Marriage? To Lorenzo? It was a solution she had never dared to dream of, a possibility that seemed too good to be true. Donatello looked from his son to Francesca, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly weighing the implications of this unexpected proposal. The crossroads had been reached, and the choice, whatever it was, would have unimaginable consequences. Chapter 11. Unmasking the Heart's True Desire. The silence that followed Lorenzo's pronouncement was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Francesca stared at him, her mind struggling to process the enormity of his proposal. Marriage? It was a solution so audacious, so unexpected, so right, that it took her breath away. Donatello, however, remained impassive, his face a mask of inscrutability. He studied his son, his eyes narrowed, his mind clearly weighing the political ramifications of such a union. The Baroness and the DeLucas, united by marriage? It was unthinkable, a violation of generations of animosity, a betrayal of the sacred code of vendetta. And yet it was also a masterstroke, a solution that could end the bloodshed, consolidate their power, and create a dynasty that would dominate the underworld for generations to come. It was a gamble, a high-stakes risk, but the potential rewards were immense. Marriage? Donatello finally said, his voice low and skeptical. You would marry her?
A baronne?
I would, Lorenzo replied, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. He turned to Francesca, his eyes searching hers, a silent question, a plea for understanding. Francesca met his gaze, her heart pounding. She saw in his eyes a mixture of determination, desire, and something else of vulnerability, a hint of the man beneath the Mafia persona, the man she had glimpsed in stolen moments, in whispered conversations, in passionate kisses. She knew the risks, the dangers, the potential for disaster. She knew that this marriage, if it happened, would be a political alliance, a strategic maneuver, not a love match. But she also knew that there was something more between them, a connection, a spark, a forbidden desire that had defied all the odds, all the obstacles. And in that moment, she made her decision. She would take the risk, embrace the danger, and follow her heart, wherever it might lead. I agree, she said, her voice clear and resolute, the words echoing in the silent room. I will marry Lorenzo. Donatello looked from Francesca to Lorenzo, his expression still unreadable. The silence stretched again, thick with tension, with unspoken emotions. The fate of two families, the future of their world, hung in the balance. Finally, Donatello spoke, his voice a low growl, his words heavy with a mixture of resignation and perhaps a hint of approval.
So be it, he said.
Let the preparations begin. The words were a decree, a command, a turning point in their lives. The war was not over, but a new chapter had begun, a chapter filled with uncertainty, with danger, but also with a glimmer of hope, a possibility of a future that had once seemed impossible. Lorenzo turned to Francesca, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else, something deeper, something that mirrored the emotions swirling within her own heart. He reached out, his hand gently taking hers, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. We have much to do, he said, his voice low and intimate, his gaze locking with hers. He led her out of the study, leaving Donatello alone with his thoughts, his plans, his machinations. As they walked through the grand halls of the DeLuca mansion, Francesca felt a sense of surreal detachment, as if she were watching a play unfold, a drama in which she was both a spectator and a participant. She was still a prisoner in a sense, but she was also something more. She was Lorenzo's betrothed, his future wife, a potential bridge between two warring families. She was a pawn, yes, but she was also a player, a force to be reckoned with. Lorenzo took her to a private sitting room, a smaller, more intimate space than the imposing study. The room was decorated in soft colors, with comfortable furniture and a fireplace that crackled with a warm, inviting glow. It was a sanctuary, a place of refuge from the storm that raged outside. He closed the door, shutting out the world, creating a private space where they could finally speak freely, without the watchful eyes and listening ears of their families. He turned to her, his expression serious, his eyes searching hers. Are you sure about this, Francesca? He asked, his voice low and urgent. This marriage, it will not be easy. There will be opposition, resistance from both sides. Francesca met his gaze, her heart filled with a newfound determination. I am sure, she said, her voice firm. I know the risks, but I also know what I feel. She reached out, her hand gently touching his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheek. It was a gesture of intimacy, of trust, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Lorenzo closed his eyes, his body leaning into her touch, his breath catching in his throat. He had wanted this, had yearned for this for so long, but he had never dared to hope, never dared to believe that it could actually happen. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers, his dark eyes filled with a raw, unfiltered emotion. "Francesca," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his words heavy with a longing that mirrored her own. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear, no doubt. Francesca met his kiss, her lips parting, her body molding against his, her heart overflowing with a love that had defied all the odds. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of pent-up emotions, a declaration of a love that had been hidden, suppressed, for too long. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a promise of a future together, a future filled with both danger and desire. As his hands moved to her waist, pulling her flesh against him, she knew. It was a mask he had worn, the detachment. The longing was just as strong in him. He revealed the truth, now, the truth of his heart. And a knock at the door shattered the moment. Chapter 12. A fortress built on shifting sands. The knock on the door was a jarring intrusion, a reminder that their newfound intimacy was fragile, a bubble of privacy in a world of constant surveillance and hidden agendas. Lorenzo pulled away reluctantly, his eyes still filled with a lingering passion, his hand still resting on Francesca's waist. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice slightly rough, his tone betraying a hint of annoyance. "It's Marco," came the muffled reply, the voice familiar, laced with a mixture of urgency and concern. Lorenzo exchanged a look with Francesca, his expression shifting from intimacy to guarded caution. He released her, his hand dropping from her waist, his body language instantly changing, becoming more formal, more controlled. He opened the door, revealing Marco standing in the hallway, his face etched with worry, his eyes scanning the room, assessing the situation. He looked from Lorenzo to Francesca, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, a silent question, a plea for reassurance. "What is it?" Lorenzo asked, his voice cool and detached, the warmth of the previous moment completely gone. "We need to talk," Marco replied, his voice urgent. "Both of you." He stepped into the room, his presence a stark reminder of the world outside, the world of family obligations, political machinations, and the ever-present threat of violence. Francesca felt a chill run down her spine. Marco's arrival signaled a shift, a return to the reality of their situation. The brief moment of intimacy, of connection, with Lorenzo had been an illusion, a fleeting escape from the harsh realities of their world. "What's happened?" Francesca asked, her voice trembling slightly, her heart filled with a growing sense of foreboding. Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else, something that looked like suspicion. "There's been a development," he said, his voice hesitant. "Regarding the marriage proposal." Lorenzo raised an eyebrow, his expression questioning. "What kind of development?" Marco hesitated again, his gaze shifting between Lorenzo and Francesca. "Donatello, he has agreed to the marriage. But he has added a condition." Francesca felt her stomach clench. A condition? What kind of condition? What new obstacle had Donatello thrown in their path? "And what is this condition?" Lorenzo asked, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Marco took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on Francesca. "He wants a guarantee. A sign of good faith. From you, Francesca." Francesca stared at him, her mind reeling. A guarantee? From her? What could he possibly mean? "What kind of guarantee?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding against her ribs. Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sorrow. "He wants you to renounce your family. Publicly. He wants you to sever all ties with the Baroness. To prove your loyalty to the DeLucas." The words hit Francesca like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of her. Renounce her family? Publicly? It was unthinkable, a betrayal of everything she held dear, a violation of the sacred bonds of family loyalty. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes pleading, searching for a sign of support, a glimmer of understanding. But his expression was unreadable, his eyes betraying nothing. He was a DeLuca after all. And blood, in their world, was thicker than water. This is outrageous, Francesca said, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. I will not do it. Francesca, Marco said, his voice softer now, pleading. It's the only way. To save Papa. To save us. Save us? Francesca repeated, her voice laced with bitterness. By sacrificing everything I believe in? By betraying my own family? It's not a betrayal, Marco argued. It's a strategic maneuver. A way to end the feud. To bring peace. Peace? Francesca scoffed. There will be no peace. Only more bloodshed. More betrayal. She turned to Lorenzo, her eyes searching his, demanding an answer. Did you know about this? She asked, her voice accusing. Was this your plan all along? Lorenzo met her gaze, his expression unwavering. I did not know, he said, his voice firm. But what? Francesca demanded, her anger rising. But I understand his reasoning, Lorenzo continued. It's a test. Of your loyalty. Of your commitment. Loyalty? Francesca repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. You speak of loyalty? After everything? After your family attacked mine? After they took my father? This is not about my family, Francesca, Lorenzo said, his voice low and intense. This is about us. About our future. About the possibility of something more. There is no us, Francesca said, her voice cold, her heart breaking. There is only this. This endless cycle of violence and betrayal. This fortress built on shifting sands. She turned away from him, her tears finally spilling over, her body trembling with a mixture of anger, grief, and a profound sense of disillusionment. The hope, the fragile spark that had ignited within her, had been extinguished, crushed by the weight of their family's hatred, by the inescapable reality of their world. The fortress, seemingly strong, was built on lies, and it was crumbling around her. Chapter 13. The tangled web of deceit and devotion. Francesca's outburst hung in the air, a stark testament to the impossible situation they were in. The room, once a sanctuary of nascent hope, now felt like a cage, the walls closing in, the air thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments. Marco watched her, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. He understood her anger, her sense of betrayal, but he also knew the brutal realities of their world. Survival, in their circles, often demanded sacrifices, compromises that chipped away at one's soul. Lorenzo, however, remained outwardly calm, his face a mask of impassivity. But beneath the surface, a storm raged. He had not anticipated his father's demand, had not foreseen the devastating impact it would have on Francesca. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that their love, their commitment, would be enough to bridge the chasm between their families. He had been wrong. Francesca, he said, his voice low and soothing, attempting to bridge the widening gap between them. I understand your anger, but you must see this is not about betraying your family. It's about choosing a different path. A path that leads to peace, to a future together. Peace? Francesca scoffed, turning back to him, her eyes blazing with fury. There is no peace with your family, Lorenzo. Only lies and manipulation. This condition, it's a trap. A way to control me, to isolate me, to break me. It's a test, Lorenzo insisted, his voice firm. A test of your loyalty. To me. To our future. And what about your loyalty, Lorenzo? Francesca challenged, her voice sharp. Where does that lie? With your family? With the man who ordered the attack on my father? Lorenzo flinched, the accusation hitting its mark. He was torn, caught between his love for Francesca and his duty to his family, a conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment they had met. My loyalty is to you, he said, his voice low and intense, his eyes searching hers. But I also have obligations. Responsibilities. Obligations? Francesca repeated, her voice laced with bitterness. To a code of honor that values violence and revenge above all else? It's not that simple, Francesca, Marco interjected, his voice pleading. You know it's not. Our families, they're not just families. They're institutions. Empires. There are rules. Expectations. And those rules dictate that I abandon my own family? Francesca asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. That I publicly denounce them? That I become a traitor? Neither Marco nor Lorenzo could meet her gaze. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken truths, with the weight of generations of hatred and mistrust. Francesca felt a profound sense of isolation, a realization that she was alone in this, caught between two warring factions, her heart torn between love and loyalty. She had believed, for a fleeting moment, that she could escape the suffocating grip of her family's world, that she could forge a new path, a future with Lorenzo. But she had been naive. The past, the weight of history, the tangled web of deceit and devotion, was too strong, too powerful to overcome. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. I cannot do it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I will not renounce my family. Lorenzo's expression remained unchanged, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of disappointment, regret, or perhaps it was simply acceptance, a realization that their love, their connection, was not enough to overcome the obstacles that stood between them. Then there is nothing more to discuss, he said, his voice cold, his tone devoid of emotion. He turned away from her, his body language signaling a withdrawal, a closing off, a return to the guarded, detached persona he had adopted since the beginning of this ordeal. Francesca felt her heart shatter, the pieces scattering like shards of glass. The hope, the fragile dream of a future together, had been extinguished, crushed by the weight of their family's feud, by the impossible choices they had been forced to make. Marco stepped forward, his hand reaching out to her, a gesture of comfort, of support. Come, Francesca, he said, his voice soft. Let's go home. Francesca allowed him to lead her out of the room, out of the De Luca mansion, out of Lorenzo's life. As they walked through the grand halls, the opulent surroundings now seemed to mock her, a reminder of the world she had almost escaped, the world that had now claimed her once again. The web, intricately spun, had ensnared her, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she might never break free. Outside, the night had grown colder. Chapter 14. Where Shadows Meet the Dawn. The ride back to the Barone's safe house was shrouded in a silence heavier than any Francesca had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of conversation, it was the absence of hope, the crushing weight of a future irrevocably altered. Marco sat beside her, his usual protective demeanor replaced by a defeated slump, his gaze fixed on the passing darkness outside the car window. Francesca, too, stared out at the night, but she saw nothing. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: grief, anger, betrayal, and a profound sense of loss. She had made her choice, had refused to betray her family, but the cost of that choice was devastating. She had lost Lorenzo, had lost the dream of a life beyond the suffocating confines of her family's world. She replayed the events of the evening in her mind, searching for a different outcome, a different path she could have taken. But there was none. Donatello's demand had been a calculated move, a test designed to break her, to force her to choose between her family and her love. And she had chosen. As the car pulled up to the safe house, Francesca felt a sense of dread wash over her. She was returning to a life of confinement, of uncertainty, of constant fear. The brief glimpse of freedom, of possibility, she had experienced with Lorenzo was now just a painful memory, a reminder of what she had lost. Inside the safe house, the atmosphere was tense, subdued. The members of their famiglia who had remained behind looked at Francesca with a mixture of pity and apprehension, their faces reflecting the grim reality of their situation. They knew, without being told, that the negotiations had failed, that the war was far from over. Marco went straight to the makeshift communications center, a corner of the room cluttered with phones, radios, and computers. He began making calls, his voice low and urgent, trying to gather information, to assess the damage, to plan their next move. Francesca watched him, her heart aching. He was carrying the weight of the family on his shoulders, the responsibility for their survival, the burden of leadership. And she had added to that burden, had complicated matters further with her refusal to comply with Donatello's demands. She retreated to the small, sparsely furnished bedroom she had been assigned, seeking a moment of solitude, a space to process her emotions. She sat on the edge of the bed, her body trembling, her tears finally flowing freely. She wept for her father, still held captive by the DeLucas, his fate uncertain. She wept for her family, trapped in a cycle of violence and betrayal, their future hanging in the balance. And she wept for herself, for the loss of her love, for the shattered dream of a life with Lorenzo. As she sat there, lost in her grief, she heard a soft knock on the door. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her heart filled with a mixture of apprehension and a flicker of hope. Could it be? "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse, her words barely a whisper. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped into the room. It wasn't Marco. It wasn't one of their men. It was Lorenzo. Francesca stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart pounding. He shouldn't be here. It was impossible. It was too dangerous. He closed the door behind him, his movements silent, his expression unreadable. He stood there for a moment, his dark eyes searching hers, his presence filling the small room with a tension that was both electric and terrifying. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and longing.
"How?"
"I have my ways," he said, his voice low and husky, his accent more pronounced than usual. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. Francesca remained seated on the bed, her body frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend his presence, his audacity, his sheer Lorenzo-ness. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer immediately. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her chilled body. "I couldn't let you go," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Not like this." Francesca's heart ached. His words, his touch, were a cruel reminder of what they had lost, of what could never be. "It's too late, Lorenzo," she said, her voice filled with a profound sadness. "We made our choices." "Choices can be unmade," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "Paths can be redirected." He knelt before her, his gaze locking with hers, his presence overwhelming. "I love you, Francesca," he said, his voice a whispered confession, the words hanging in the air, heavy with a truth that had been unspoken for too long. The words, the raw emotion in his voice, shattered the last of Francesca's defenses. Her tears flowed anew, but this time they were tears of relief, of release, of a love that had defied all the odds, all the obstacles. Dawn was breaking, but where the shadows met the burgeoning light, there was him. Chapter 15. The Reckoning of Broken Vows. Lorenzo's declaration of love, whispered in the pre-dawn gloom of the safe house, hung in the air, a fragile counterpoint to the danger that surrounded them. It was a truth that had been simmering beneath the surface, a forbidden desire that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. And now it was out in the open, a force to be reckoned with. Francesca stared at him, her heart overflowing with a mixture of joy and fear. She loved him too, had loved him from the moment he had kissed her in the shadowed alcove of the church. But their love was a dangerous game, a dance on the edge of a precipice. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice trembling, "this is madness. You shouldn't be here. It's too risky." "I don't care about the risk," he said, his voice firm, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "I care about you." He reached out, his hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. His touch was a balm, a soothing presence in the midst of the chaos, a reminder of the connection that bound them together. "We can find a way, Francesca," he said, his voice low and urgent. "A way to be together. A way to end this madness." "How?" she asked, her voice filled with a desperate hope. Your father, my family, they'll never allow it. We won't ask for their permission, he said, his voice a low growl. We'll take what is ours. We'll forge our own path. His words were a rebellion, a defiance of the rules that had governed their lives for so long. It was a dangerous proposition, a gamble that could cost them everything. But it was also a promise, a commitment to a future together, a future free from the constraints of their family's feud. Francesca looked at him, her heart filled with a newfound courage. She had spent her life conforming, obeying, suppressing her own desires. But no more. She would not be a pawn in their game any longer. She would choose her own destiny. She would choose love. What do you propose? She asked, her voice stronger now, her eyes meeting his with a newfound determination. Lorenzo smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a shiver down her spine. We elope, he said, his voice simple, direct, the words carrying the weight of a momentous decision. Francesca's breath caught in her throat. Elope? It was a radical idea, a complete break from tradition, a violation of everything their families stood for. It was also exhilarating. Elope? She repeated, her voice a mixture of disbelief and excitement. Tonight, he said, his eyes locking with hers. We leave tonight. We disappear. We start a new life. Together. The proposition was both terrifying and liberating. It was a leap of faith, a jump into the unknown. But it was also a chance to escape the suffocating grip of their family's world, a chance to build a future based on love, not on duty or obligation. Francesca hesitated for only a moment, her mind racing, weighing the risks and the rewards. Then she nodded, her decision made. Yes, she said, her voice firm, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Let's elope. Lorenzo's smile widened, his eyes lighting up with a joy that mirrored her own. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tender kiss that sealed their pact, their commitment to a future together. But their moment of intimacy was short-lived. A sudden commotion outside the room, the sound of raised voices, of hurried footsteps, shattered the fragile peace. Reality intruded, a harsh reminder of the dangers that still lurked, the obstacles they still had to overcome. Lorenzo pulled away, his expression instantly shifting from lover to protector. He moved to the door, his hand reaching for the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Stay here, he said, his voice low and urgent. And don't open the door for anyone. He slipped out of the room, his movements silent, his presence a reassuring force in the face of the unknown. Francesca remained on the bed, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She listened to the sounds outside, trying to decipher what was happening. She heard Marco's voice, raised in anger, and other voices, unfamiliar voices, speaking in rapid Italian. There was a struggle, a brief, violent exchange, and then silence. A silence that was more terrifying than any noise. Francesca waited, her body tense, her breath held captive in her chest. She didn't know what had happened, who had won, who had lost. She only knew that her future, her life, hung in the balance. The reckoning had come, and the broken vows of their families were being called to account. Chapter 16. A haven in the heart of chaos. The silence stretched, an agonizing eternity that seemed to amplify Francesca's fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent shivers down her spine. She was trapped, alone, uncertain of what had transpired outside her door, uncertain of Lorenzo's fate. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, she heard a soft knock. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it Lorenzo? Or someone else? Francesca? It was Lorenzo's voice, low and urgent, laced with a hint of relief. She rushed to the door, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the lock. She pulled it open, her eyes searching his face, desperate for reassurance. He stood there, his clothes slightly disheveled, a small cut above his eyebrow, but otherwise unharmed. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else, something that looked like triumph. Are you all right? She asked, her voice breathless, her hands reaching out to touch him, to confirm that he was real, that he was safe. "I'm fine," he said, his voice soothing. "But we have to go."
Now.
"What happened?" she asked, her mind racing, trying to piece together the events that had unfolded outside her door. "Marco," he found out, Lorenzo said, his voice grim. "About us. About the plan."
How?
"He had someone watching me," Lorenzo said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "He didn't trust me." "And?" Francesca prompted, her heart pounding, fearing the worst. "He tried to stop us," Lorenzo said, his voice low and intense. "There was a confrontation." "Is he?" Francesca couldn't bring herself to say the word. The thought of her brother injured, or worse, too painful to bear. "He's alive," Lorenzo said, his voice reassuring. "But he's not happy." Francesca felt the wave of relief wash over her, followed by a pang of guilt. She loved her brother, but she also loved Lorenzo. And she had chosen Lorenzo. "We have to go," Lorenzo repeated, his voice urgent. "Before anyone else finds out." He took her hand, his grip firm, possessive, and led her out of the room, out of the safe house, out of the life she had always known. They moved quickly, silently, through the deserted streets, the pre-dawn darkness concealing their escape. Lorenzo had a car waiting, a nondescript sedan, parked a few blocks away. They got in, and he started the engine, his movements swift and efficient, his eyes constantly scanning the streets, alert for any sign of pursuit. "Where are we going?" Francesca asked, her voice trembling slightly, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Somewhere safe," he said, his voice reassuring. "Somewhere they won't find us." He drove fast, the city lights blurring past, the distance between them and their former lives growing with each passing mile. Francesca watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. He had risked everything for her, had defied his family, his obligations, his entire world, for their love. As they drove, the first rays of dawn began to break through the darkness, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. It was a new day, a new beginning, a chance to forge a new life, together. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at their destination. It was a small, secluded villa, nestled in the hills overlooking the city. It was a haven, a refuge from the chaos, a place where they could be together, away from the prying eyes and judging whispers of their families. Lorenzo stopped the car, and they got out, the fresh morning air filling their lungs. Francesca looked around, her eyes taking in the beauty of their surroundings. The villa was surrounded by gardens, filled with flowers and trees, the air alive with the sound of birdsong. It was a world away from the concrete and steel of the city, a world away from the violence and betrayal of their former lives. Lorenzo took her hand, and they walked towards the villa, their steps slow and deliberate, their silence filled with unspoken emotions, with a shared understanding of the momentous step they had taken. He opened the door, and they stepped inside, entering a new chapter of their lives, a chapter filled with uncertainty, with danger, but also with the promise of love, of happiness, of a future they had chosen, together. It was a haven, yes, but it was also a beginning. A haven in the heart of chaos, found. Chapter 17. The Echo of a Kiss, the Threat of War. The villa was a sanctuary, a world away from the turmoil and danger they had left behind. It was simply furnished, but elegant, with large windows that offered breathtaking views of the city and the surrounding countryside. It felt like a different world, a place where they could shed the burdens of their past and embrace a future of their own making. For the first few days, they lived in a blissful bubble, a cocoon of intimacy and shared joy. They spent their time exploring the villa and its gardens, talking for hours, sharing their hopes and dreams, their fears and vulnerabilities. They made love, their passion fueled by the danger they had faced, the risks they had taken, the love that had defied all the odds. It was a honeymoon, a brief respite from the storm that still raged around them. But they both knew it couldn't last. The world they had left behind, the families they had defied, would not simply disappear. The echo of their past actions, like the echo of their first, forbidden kiss, would inevitably reach them. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lorenzo broke the silence, his voice serious, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to talk about the future, Francesca," he said. Francesca nodded, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. She knew this moment would come, the moment when reality would intrude upon their idyllic retreat. "What about it?" she asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching his. "We can't stay hidden forever," he said. "Our families, they'll be looking for us. They won't give up." "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "We have two choices," he continued. "We can run, disappear, try to build a new life somewhere far away. Or we can fight. We can try to end this feud, once and for all." Francesca looked at him, her mind racing. Running was tempting, the idea of escaping the violence and betrayal, of starting fresh, was appealing. But it also felt like a betrayal of her own values, a surrender to the forces that had tried to control her life for so long. Fighting, on the other hand, was dangerous, terrifying, the odds stacked against them. But it was also a chance to reclaim their lives, to forge a future where their love wouldn't be a forbidden secret, but a source of strength, a foundation for a new beginning. "What do you want to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, her heart pounding against her ribs. Lorenzo met her gaze, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I want to fight," he said. "I want to end this. For us. For our future." Francesca nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She loved his courage, his strength, his unwavering commitment to their love. "Then we fight," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his with a newfound resolve. They spent the next few days planning, strategizing, making contacts with the few allies they had left in both families, people who were tired of the endless cycle of violence and betrayal, people who believed in a different future. It was a dangerous game, a delicate dance on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, could cost them everything. One morning, as they were working on their plans, a messenger arrived, a young man, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He brought news that shattered their fragile peace, news that threatened to plunge them back into the heart of the storm. "Donatello De Luca, he's declared war," the messenger said, his voice trembling. "He's calling on all his allies. He's coming for you." Francesca felt a cold dread creep through her veins. The threat, the inevitable confrontation, had arrived. The war, the one they had hoped to avoid, was now upon them. The echo of that first, forbidden kiss had called down a storm. Lorenzo looked at her, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "It's time," he said. He reached for his weapon, a gesture that was both terrifying and reassuring. He was a warrior, a protector, a man ready to fight for his love, for his future. Francesca nodded, her heart pounding, her fear overshadowed by a sense of purpose, a determination to stand by his side, to face whatever came their way. They were ready, or as ready as they could ever be. The threat of war loomed, but so did the strength of their love. Chapter 18. Blood and Tears, Love and Sacrifice. The declaration of war was a catalyst, a spark that ignited the simmering tensions between the two families. The fragile peace that had existed, a tense truce built on mutual distrust, shattered completely. The underworld was plunged into chaos, a maelstrom of violence, betrayal, and desperate power struggles. Lorenzo and Francesca found themselves at the center of the storm, hunted, targeted, their love a beacon of defiance in a world consumed by hatred. They moved from safe house to safe house, relying on the loyalty of a dwindling number of allies, their lives constantly at risk. The villa, their sanctuary, was no longer safe. They abandoned it, leaving behind the brief respite of peace and intimacy, returning to the shadows, to the dangerous game of survival. Lorenzo, with Francesca by his side, began to rally his forces, reaching out to those within the De Luca family who were disillusioned with Donatello's ruthless reign, those who yearned for a different future, a future free from the endless cycle of violence. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with danger. Every meeting, every communication was a risk, a potential betrayal. But Lorenzo was relentless, driven by his love for Francesca, by his determination to build a better world for them both. Francesca, too, played her part. She used her knowledge of the Barone family, her connections, her understanding of the intricate web of alliances and rivalries to help Lorenzo navigate the treacherous landscape of the underworld. She was no longer the sheltered, obedient daughter of Don Antonio. She was a warrior, a strategist, a woman fighting for her love, for her future. One evening, as they were huddled in a small, dimly lit apartment in a neutral territory, they received news that changed everything. Marco, Francesca's brother, had reached out, requesting a meeting. Lorenzo was wary, suspicious. Marco had tried to stop them before, had betrayed their trust. He saw this as a trap, a ploy by Donatello to lure them out into the open. But Francesca believed there was a chance, a glimmer of hope that her brother had finally seen the light, that he was ready to break free from the suffocating grip of their father's world. "I have to go," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting Lorenzo's with a determined plea. "I have to see him." Lorenzo hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his trust in Francesca's judgment. He knew the risks, the potential for disaster. But he also knew that he couldn't control her, couldn't keep her locked away, a prisoner of his love. "All right," he said, his voice reluctant. "But I'm going with you." The meeting took place in a neutral location, a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a tense, fraught encounter, the air thick with suspicion and unspoken accusations. Marco stood alone, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else, something that looked like desperation. "Francesca," he said, his voice hoarse, his gaze avoiding Lorenzo's. "I made a mistake." Francesca looked at him, her heart aching for her brother, for the man he once was, before the darkness of their world had consumed him. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching his. I shouldn't have tried to stop you," he said. "I see that now. Donatello, he's lost. He's consumed by hatred, by revenge. He'll destroy us all." Lorenzo remained silent, his hand resting on his weapon, his eyes fixed on Marco, assessing the threat, the sincerity of his words. "I want to help you," Marco continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I want to end this, before it's too late." Francesca looked at Lorenzo, her eyes pleading for his trust, for his understanding. She believed her brother, believed in his change of heart. Lorenzo hesitated for a moment, his internal conflict evident. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of acceptance. "What do you propose?" he asked, his voice still guarded, his eyes still wary. Marco outlined a plan, a daring, dangerous plan to overthrow Donatello, to end his reign of terror, to bring peace to the two families. It was a gamble, a high-stakes risk, but it was also their only chance. Blood had been spilled, and tears had been shed. But in the midst of the chaos, love and sacrifice had emerged as the only true path forward. Chapter 19. The Unfolding of Destiny's Design. Marco's plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. It involved a coordinated attack on Donatello's stronghold, a simultaneous assault from within and without, designed to cripple his forces and force his surrender. It relied on the loyalty of key members of both families, people who had grown weary of the endless bloodshed, people who yearned for a different future. The risks were immense. Failure would mean certain death, not just for Lorenzo and Francesca, but for everyone involved. But the potential reward, a lasting peace, a future free from the shadow of vendetta, was worth the gamble. They spent the next few days meticulously planning the operation, coordinating movements, securing alliances, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. It was a tense, nerve-wracking period, filled with uncertainty and the constant threat of discovery. Francesca, despite her fear, found herself energized by the challenge. She was no longer a passive observer, a pawn in her family's game. She was an active participant, a key player in the unfolding drama, her intelligence, her courage, and her determination proving invaluable to the cause. Lorenzo, too, was transformed. The weight of leadership, the responsibility for the lives of those who had pledged their loyalty to him, had forged him into a stronger, more resolute man. He was no longer just a rebellious son, defying his father's authority. He was a leader, a warrior, a man fighting for a future he believed in. The night of the planned assault arrived, a night filled with both dread and anticipation. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the whispered communications between the various factions, the final preparations for the battle to come. Francesca and Lorenzo found themselves side by side, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating in unison. They had come so far, had faced so much danger, had overcome so many obstacles. And now, they were on the verge of the final confrontation, the ultimate test of their love, their loyalty, their courage. "Are you ready?" Lorenzo asked, his voice low and intimate, his eyes searching hers. Francesca nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I'm ready." They shared a kiss, a brief, passionate kiss that was both a promise and a farewell, a testament to the love that had sustained them through the darkness, a beacon of hope in the face of the impending storm. Then, they moved, each to their assigned positions, ready to play their part in the unfolding of destiny's design. The plan was intricate, a complex web of coordinated movements, relying on precise timing and flawless execution. Francesca, along with a small group of trusted allies, was tasked with infiltrating Donatello's mansion, disabling his security systems, and opening the way for Lorenzo's forces to storm the compound. It was a dangerous mission, fraught with peril. But Francesca was not afraid. She had come too far, had sacrificed too much, to back down now. She was a Barone, yes, but she was also Lorenzo's love, a woman fighting for her future, for a world where love could triumph over hatred, where peace could replace violence. As she moved through the shadows, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert, she thought of her father, still held captive by Donatello. She hoped, prayed, that he was still alive, that she would be able to save him, to bring him home. But she also knew that there were no guarantees, that this night could end in tragedy, that she might never see her father, or Lorenzo, again. The unfolding of Destiny's design was unpredictable, a tapestry woven with threads of love and hate, of loyalty and betrayal, of hope and despair. And as Francesca stepped into the darkness, she knew that she was walking into the heart of the storm, a storm that would determine the fate of two families, the future of their world. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The infiltration of Donatello's mansion was a tense, nerve-wracking operation. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every creak of the floorboards a potential alarm. Francesca moved with a stealth and precision she hadn't known she possessed, guided by her knowledge of the mansion's layout, her determination fueled by her love for Lorenzo, and her desire to end the cycle of violence. She and her team successfully disabled the security systems, opening the way for Lorenzo's forces to breach the compound. The sounds of battle erupted outside, a cacophony of gunfire, shouts, and explosions, a stark reminder of the stakes, the brutal reality of their world. Francesca's mission, however, was not yet complete. She had one final task, to find her father, Don Antonio, and free him from Donatello's clutches. She moved through the mansion, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert, navigating the familiar corridors, now transformed into a battleground. She encountered resistance, guards loyal to Donatello, but she overcame them, her determination and newfound skills proving more than a match for their brutality. Finally, she reached the room where her father was being held. The door was guarded, but Francesca, using a combination of stealth and force, managed to overpower the guards and enter the room. Don Antonio was there, bound to a chair, his face bruised and battered, but his eyes still burning with defiance. He looked at Francesca, his expression a mixture of surprise and pride. "Francesca," he said, his voice hoarse, his words a mixture of relief and disbelief. What are you doing here?" "I'm getting you out of here, Papa," she said, her voice firm, her hands working quickly to untie the ropes that bound him. As she freed her father, the door to the room burst open, and Donatello De Luca stormed in, his face contorted with rage, a weapon in his hand. "You," he snarled, his eyes fixed on Francesca. "You traitor!" He raised his weapon, aiming it at Francesca, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Lorenzo appeared in the doorway, his own weapon drawn, his expression a mask of fury. "Donatello!" he roared, his voice echoing through the room. "It's over." The two men faced each other, father and son, locked in a final, deadly confrontation. The air was thick with tension, with hatred, with the weight of generations of animosity. "You dare defy me?" Donatello hissed, his eyes blazing with madness. "You choose her over your own family?" "I choose peace," Lorenzo replied, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "I choose love. I choose a future free from your hatred." The standoff continued, a tense, heart-stopping moment that would determine the fate of everyone in the room, the future of two families. Then, with a sudden, swift movement, Lorenzo fired. His shot found its mark, striking Donatello in the shoulder, knocking him off balance. Donatello staggered, his weapon clattering to the floor. The battle was over. Donatello's reign of terror had ended. Lorenzo rushed to Francesca's side, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice urgent. Francesca nodded, her body trembling, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, gratitude, and sorrow. She had won, they had won, but the cost had been high. She looked at her father, who was now standing, leaning against the wall for support, his face a mixture of pain and something else, something that looked like understanding. "Papa," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with tears. Don Antonio held up his hand, silencing her. "It's all right, mia figlia," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You did what you had to do." He looked at Lorenzo, his gaze unwavering. "You saved my life," he said, his voice gruff, but filled with a grudging respect. Lorenzo nodded, his expression solemn. "It was the only way," he said. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had ended. The bloodshed, the tears, the sacrifices, had paved the way for a new beginning, a future where love, not hatred, would reign. Epilogue. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The wounds of the past, the deep-seated animosity between the two families, did not heal overnight. There were those who resisted the new order, who clung to the old ways, who whispered of revenge and retribution. But Lorenzo and Francesca, with the support of Marco, who had become a crucial ally in the rebuilding process, persevered. They worked tirelessly to bridge the divide, to foster understanding and cooperation, to create a world where their children could grow up without the constant threat of violence and betrayal. Don Antonio, though initially resistant to the changes, eventually came to accept the new reality. He saw in Francesca and Lorenzo a strength, a determination, a love that transcended the hatred that had consumed his own life. He retired from his position as head of the Barone family, handing over the reins to Marco, who proved to be a wise and just leader, committed to peace and reconciliation. Donatello De Luca, stripped of his power and influence, lived out his remaining years in a self-imposed exile, a bitter, broken man, a testament to the destructive power of hatred and revenge. Lorenzo and Francesca, however, thrived. They built a life together, a life based on love, trust, and mutual respect. They had children who grew up knowing nothing of the feud that had once threatened to tear their parents apart. They created a family that was both Barone and De Luca, a symbol of unity, a testament to the power of love to overcome even the most deeply entrenched hatred. They often returned to the villa, the haven where they had found refuge during the darkest days of the war. It became a place of remembrance, a place of healing, a place where they could reconnect with the love that had sustained them through the storm. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Francesca turned to Lorenzo, her eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to touch his. "Choosing me? Choosing this life?" Lorenzo smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his gaze locking with hers. "Never," he said, his voice firm, his hand clasping hers tightly. "You were the best choice I ever made." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tender kiss that was a testament to their enduring love, a love that had conquered all, a love that had brought peace to a world once consumed by war. The city lights twinkled below them, a myriad of tiny sparks against the velvet darkness. They were home, together, and that was all that mattered.